Good morning, world changers. Kyle Davies here, and I'm with you all week. So today I'm going to be talking a little bit about, all week, I'm going to be talking about the connection between stress, disease, emotion, and the meaning of life, should we say, the meaning of life, how we contribute to the creation of our experience. And how we can, by understanding that, we can impact our level of health. Because there's one way of seeing things where we view the world as happening to us, and then there is a slightly different way of seeing the world and feeling and understanding the world where we understand that life is flowing through us. So in the work that I do and the clients that I work with, I take people on a journey, and that journey starts with looking at the conventional paradigm of, I'm a separate being having this experience. I'm a victim of circumstance. Life is happening to me, and I just got to kind of roll with it. And I take people on a journey from starting at that point to moving through almost the slightly new age notion of, right, well, life is happening for me. There's opportunities in what's going on, which is still viewing kind of things from outside in. And I take them through to this space where we begin to see that, life is actually happening through me, because maybe I'm a little bit more connected to all that is than I was aware. And then I am life, just as a flower blossoms, and the flower blossoming is the experience of life manifesting itself through that flower. We're very much the same. So that's the journey I take people on, and I'm going to be sort of talking, I suppose, a little bit about that. So much of what I say and talking about today is me talking a little bit about stress and the connections between stress and disease. And in my approach to that, I guess my approach has been been doing this since about 2002, has been really one of seeking to be intuitive and led by the experiences of my clients. So it's sort of academic light from that perspective. So whilst I'm a fan of science, I'm also kind of conscious that science can lag behind, which is interesting because it's really all the smart people are in science. I do have a background in science, and I got letters after my name and all that kind of stuff. But interestingly, I was in talking at a conference in California, talking about my work, which is called energy flow coaching. And I was talking about the connection between stress, disease, health, spirituality. And a couple of people came up to me after this conference last November and said, it's really interesting because there's now science to back up what you've said. So back in probably 2002, 2003, through the 2000s, maybe that science wasn't there. Whereas now, it seems like it might be there. Which it's good in a way, isn't it? Because we all seem to certainly in the Western world, we seem to like to gravitate towards science. And if science says it's so, then it must be right. But then there is probably people in this group, the coaches that do this sort of work are maybe a little bit ahead of the game and looking at things before science does. So I'm just trying to put a bit of context there in terms of the nature of the material that I'm going to be talking about. I'll be offering little bits of science thrown in, but a lot of, in terms of my take on it, is two things. My own kind of intuitive conception of life, but also a lot of it is looking to create and generate a process that I can work with people or is palatable for those that I'm working with, and simple enough that people can take concepts and apply them in their lives. So hopefully what I say is stuff that you can kind of put into your own life, just looking at the questions every now and again. So yes, if I say anything at all which is remotely confusing, then obviously please do say. So starting with a little bit about stress. Well, thinking about the stress is such an overused word these days, isn't it? It's kind of interesting. I spend half my time working within the corporate world, doing coaching and running workshops and these sorts of things. And it is interesting. People, for the most part, when thinking about stress, are thinking about that overwhelming feeling that they have. They're thinking about psychological stress. And there's a couple, I think, of interesting things about stress, of thinking about the origins of stress. So from my recollection of it, probably the forefather of modern day stress was a guy called Dr. Hans Selye. And again, because I haven't seen the other speakers, other people may have talked about Hans Selye. And he was working in the 1920s and 30s, and he sort of happened across stress by chance because, of course, he was working with rats, because that's what we all do, don't we? In academic institutions, we take the little furry things and we do things to them. And that's what he was doing. So he was injecting rats with ovarian extract to try to see if there was any effect of that. And what he found was that they were getting peptic ulcers, they were getting immune tissue damage and adrenal damage. I was thinking, oh, right, well, this ovarian extract is knackering these rats then, isn't it? So this experiment's working. And then he thought, well, maybe as a good scientist, I should run a control group. So he ran a control group and bizarrely found that his rats displayed the exact same symptoms that went along with peptic ulcers, adrenal damage, and immune tissue damage. Chin chin. And he thought, well, there's something funny going on here. And then talking to some of his colleagues, you know, they were sort of saying, well, you're kind of a bit rough with these rats, aren't you, Hans? You know, you're fumbling them, you're dropping them, and he was dropping them on the floor. They were scooting behind cupboards. He was chasing them with a broom handle. So he was giving them a bit of a rough time. And we thought, well, maybe there's something to do with the fact that I'm beating the shit out of these rats. That may be part of the reason why they're exhibiting these symptoms. So we decided to run an entire experiment then, looking at this idea of, okay, well, I'm gonna disturb these rats. I'm gonna stress these rats out in a variety of ways. So he starved some, and he put some in a hot place, some in a cold place. He made some work very hard. So he kind of stressed there from this perspective of their environment, some physical things, some emotional things. And he found in all cases that they all exhibited these symptoms of adrenal damage, peptic ulcers, and immune tissue damage. And then came to the conclusion that, well, when we stress a rat, it begins to exhibit symptoms. So you push it to a limit and then its body begins to break down. And I'm not going to go into all the kind of mechanics of stress, but I think there are some sort of particularly interesting points with that. And so that's the one bit. I mean, what he goes on to talk about in terms of, well, what happens and what causes stress, and how does stress cause disease? That's where, from what academics say, maybe Selye began to fall down. But his original ideas probably made him the godfather of stress. So, like many things in stress, many things in science, he found it out by accident. And I think that's always worth us bearing in mind. But I think very interesting to find. This is the origins. He's cack-handed with his rats and then puts them in a variety of contexts. But I think one of the interesting things with stress there, and there's a variety of interesting things with stress, but one of the interesting things is that, and probably the thing that makes stress difficult to work with, is that the impact can vary not only between individuals, but within an individual. So what may trigger the stress response one day may not trigger the same stress response the next day. So from a perspective of kind of being human, there's an argument to say that certainly what I see when I go in the workplace is people seem to be constantly stressed, and this understanding, well, why is that? Are we all being handled by our bosses like Hans Selye was handling his rats? That may be true to a certain extent. But I think one of the important things is that one interesting way of looking at it potentially is that our environment has changed enormously. So for hundreds of thousands of years, we lived in little tribes and villages of probably about 150 people where we knew everybody. Our lives were pretty small. We went and did a bit of hunting, a bit of fishing. We had a fight with the tribe down the road. And our lives were reasonably small. And we faced possibly our mortality may have been challenged on a daily basis. And, you hear a crack in the forest and there's a bear behind you and your body mobilizes and goes into the stress response, and your memory's a bit sharper, your eyesight and hearing are better, your muscles are mobilized, and ideally then you escape. And as long as you run faster than the guy next to you, you're okay, aren't you? So the idea being that we evolved for hundreds of thousands of years with where we were faced with short-term physical stresses, and our bodies and brains adapted and evolved in that environment and thrived in that environment. And of course, what we face these days is over the last 100 years, even over the last 20 years, our environment has changed enormously. So what that means is that what we're facing these days is very different. And the argument is that, well, our bodies and brains have probably not adapted to the rate of change. So it is important to remember, in terms of good stress and bad stress, that actually we are designed for short-term amounts of stress. So one of the good things about stress is that, well, let's keep it short-term. And if stress, so it's a bit like if you want to get fit, then you go out and you go to the gym and you push yourself hard, or you go for a run and you push yourself hard and you physically stress your body. And when you physically stress your body, then your body adapts and it becomes a little bit stronger. And it's the same emotionally. If you want to challenge yourself, you come out of your comfort zone. And when you come out of your comfort zone, it adapts and you're able to deal with more things. So that the whole kind of idea of a short-term stress, regardless of the stressor, will serve to facilitate growth is one that we need to bear in mind. So going out and facing a bit of discomfort, facing a challenge and embracing that is actually a useful thing. So there's a couple of things I want to, and I'm going to have to start talking quickly now, looking at the time. There's a couple of interesting facts about stress I personally think are really important when it comes to looking at our health and the connection between disease and stress. The first thing is it's entirely possible for our body to be in a state of stress and that light outside of our conscious awareness. Again, we have to get rid of, to a certain extent, this idea that stress is just this overwhelming feeling that we have. That's one type of stress. When we say, oh my God, I'm stressed out, that's one type of stress. So we need to open up to this first idea. It's entirely possible for body and brain to be stressed, even though consciously I may not be aware of that. And it makes me think of, I remember years ago reading a book by a guy called Dr. David Servan Schreiber, and his book was called Healing Without Prozac and Freud. And he talks about this experiment he's doing. And in the experiment, he's trying to look at the stress responses in the body, and he's measuring blood pressure, heart rate, and the activity of the emotional brain, I think. And he's showing people disturbing films. So he's got this one lady in the lab, and she's strapped up to everything, and she's watching this film. And her heart rate is getting higher, and her blood pressure is getting higher, and the activity of her emotional brain is kind of going off the charts. And he's thinking, oh shit, this lady's really stressed. I better go and check she's all right. So he goes into the lab, and he says, are you okay? Do you want me to turn this off? And she looks at him with this element of surprise and says, oh no, I'm perfectly fine. I'm quite happy watching this. So what he said from that was, well, she's not particularly emotionally intelligent. What I would say from that is, well, the fact that she's not aware at all of her body being in a state of stress means that over time she's not aware of that, or doesn't develop an awareness of that. That's likely to potentially result in her becoming ill. So that's one of the really important points. I'll be talking as we go through the week, well, how do we address that? It's all about self-awareness, really. And a huge part of my work, what I always encourage people to do is be empowered and develop your self-awareness. So that's the first thing. The second really important thing about stress, again, which you may already know, but I think is incredibly important, is the idea that the stress response in the body is pretty much the same regardless of the stress. And we saw that with the work of Hans Selye. So what that effectively means is that whether it's your environment, you sat in a draft in Starbucks, whether it's something physical, you may be challenging yourself at the gym, maybe it's something emotional, you have a perception of being under threat at work. The stress response is basically the same. So looking at stressors as a build-up potentially from a variety of sources, I think is incredibly important. Now, the way I look at this to make it very simple is to say, well, it's like we've got a stress bucket. And when I'm working with people from a health perspective, I say there are 4 pillars of health. We've got emotion and mindset, we've got sleep and recovery, nutrition, exercise and movement, and we have to look at all of those 4, because when we don't look at all four potentially go in our stress bucket. So if you have a bad diet or you're ingesting toxins, that's in your stress bucket. If you are not sleeping well or poor sleep, that's in your stress bucket. If you're leading a sedentary lifestyle, that's a stressor. If you sat down too long, if you have a car accident, that's a stressor. If you have some surgery, that's a stressor. If you're exposed to too much heat, too much cold, that is a stressor. If you have a case of flu, that's a stressor. Now, one of the critical things then when it comes to our health is that we're used to looking at health in this linear way where we're thinking, right, well, X leads to Y. So if we know X, we can figure out what Y is. And that comes from our medicalized mindset, because medicine, its origins were trying to identify a single set of symptoms that went with a particular disease and a particular treatment for that in a very linear fashion. What we have with the plethora of chronic health challenges that we face these days is there are multiple primary causes, and they act almost in a circular fashion where causes can become effects. So one of the things I think is always useful is having a look at, well, what might be in my stress bucket? And even if, a take home is, well, let's just have a look what's in my stress bucket. Because it's very easy to not really pay attention to some of the things that are going on. So I had a mate recently, and he ended up being off work for a period of time because there was a lot of emotionally stressful stuff, because the emotion is always the biggest stuff, and that's why most of the work I do with my clients is with emotion, and we're going to be talking about emotion as we go through the week. So my friend, he had a lot of emotional stuff that was happening in his life with job and family and various things. And with his parents, and his father had died, and then he went and had a minor surgery, and he had the surgery, and he didn't have any time off. He went straight back into work, and then boom, he got some virus which knocked him out for a month. And it wasn't the virus that knocked him out for a month. It was because the virus was the surgery was the final straw. Probably the virus might be in the final straw in a full stress bucket. And then when the stress bucket was overflowing, then that was it, symptoms. And tomorrow I'm going to be talking about how symptoms are solutions. But in terms of, right, well, how does that full stress bucket lead to symptoms? In the work that I do with anxiety, depression, chronic fatigue, chronic pain, irritable bowel, those sorts of things, there's a chain reaction. It goes a bit like this. A body and brain in a perpetual state of stress leads to a rewiring of neural pathways, primarily within the midbrain. This is hypothesis, by the way, rather than being actual fact. So a buildup of long-term stress, rewiring in neural pathways within the midbrain. This leads to dysfunction or irregularities in the systems of the body, the immune system, the endocrine system, and nervous system, as we've seen with what happened with Hans Selye's rats. Dysfunction then, or irregularities in the systems of the body, leads to a plethora, a diverse range of symptoms. And this is why, for me, anxiety and depression are umbrella terms for a range of physical and emotional symptoms. And again, for me, why there's not so much of a distinction between mental health and physical health. There is just health and well-being. So that's our long-term stress path. So you've got overactivity, you've got build-up of long-term stress, rewiring of neural pathways, overactivity or irregularity within the systems, then symptoms. And what we need to do is come back and understand, turn off the stress response effectively. There's raging debate about, well, how is it that stress causes disease? And one of the arguments can be, well, if you're fighting fires all the time, if you have a big building and loads of people working in the building, you got plumbers, you got electricians, you got cooks and all that kind of stuff, painters, decorators, and then there's a bit of a fire and everyone's queuing up to get buckets of water to throw over the fire. Nobody's working on the other little jobs they have to work on. And if they're constantly believing that there's a fire, then the maintenance to the building just kind of goes down. So then the weather is affecting the building and the building deteriorates very quickly because nobody's working on it. That's effectively what happens in stress, is when the stress response is stuck on, which it is for many of us in today's modern life, then the long-term building projects get put to one side. And that means that all sorts of other things can happen. And that probably plays a role in things like cancer, heart disease, and all the rest of it. So, okay, that's covering stress and disease from the Kyle Davies perspective. Quick book plug, remember, The Intelligent Body, available at Barnes & Noble, Waterstones. I don't know if I might get told off for book plugs every day. But think about your stress bucket and don't just think about emotional stress. Think about, well, everything affects everything else. And, effects become causes. A bad night's sleep is not only a symptom of a full stress bucket, but it's actually a cause as well. So when you begin to open up and think about in a non-linear way and multiple primary causes, then it begins to make a bit of sense. So tomorrow I'm going to go in and talk a bit more about symptoms as solutions, and then we're going to bring in emotions, and then we're going to bring a little bit of how I create my experience of reality. I hope it was kind of bold to try to talk about all of that in a short period of time. So if I get confusing, again, please do say. So hopefully that's been useful this morning. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening in, and I look forward to seeing you all tomorrow. Have a good day. Namaste.